Hello, I'm Malcolm Cox, and this is another Tuesday teaching tip. And today we're talking about preaching to Jewish people. Preaching in the context of a normal church service, but perhaps with people from a Jewish background there who might not be Christians, or even people who are Christians from a Jewish background. Why is this so important? Well, there are a lot of people from a Jewish background all around the world and may come into our church services and may become members of our churches. And we need to understand some of the cultural sensitivities. I was put onto this topic by two people a few years ago. One was a chap who became a Christian from a Jewish background and pointed me to an article called A Guide for Preachers, Suggestions for Biblically Faithful and Jewish Sensitive Preaching. And I'll post a link to that article underneath this video. And the other was my wife. My wife, as a doctor, works in a predominantly Jewish area of London and has many patients who are from that background and even work colleagues. And so she became more understanding of the sorts of phrases, words that can be offensive to people from a Jewish background that I and others like me might not realize are so offensive. So I want to quote a little bit from this article. And you can read the whole article yourself. It's not very long, but it is very, very helpful. For example, the term Jew or the Jews can be a very pejorative and negative term heard through the ears of someone who's from that kind of background. Why? Because that's the way that Hitler and the people of his generation talked about people from a Jewish background. They labeled them. They just talked about them as being the Jews. And that may not sound offensive to me or someone like me, but when it was used in that context, it's still in the cultural memory of people from that background. So many of my wife's patients don't know their family tree and never will, because generations were wiped out in the Holocaust. And so for them to come into a church service and hear a phrase like, the Jews killed Jesus, it alienates and offends them so much they're not going to be able to hear an accurate and fair presentation of the gospel anymore. So it's up to us preachers and teachers to make sure we, instead of using phrases like the Jews, we use a phrase like the Jewish people. Much better idea. It wasn't the Jews who killed Jesus. It was sinners who killed Jesus. They happened, the people who nailed him to the cross, of course, were actually Romans. So let's make sure that we don't give unnecessary offense. The gospel does offend, but let's not make sure it offends for the right reason. Let me read you this phrase. For some Messianic Jews and Jewish Christians, faith in Jesus has resulted in ostracism from families and friends. To then find themselves in churches where derogatory remarks about the Jewish people and Israel are a frequent feature of the preaching and the Christian press is deeply painful. For many Jewish people, becoming Christians is hugely costly. They need to feel safe and welcome in our congregations. The preaching of the cross should be the only stumbling block in our preaching, not the phrases that we use about people. So, what do we do about this? Well, we have to be careful about what we say and how we say it. We can use those phrases, the Israelite people or the Jewish people, rather than the Jews. It's an interesting thought that in the New Testament, Judaizing is condemned, and that's in a lot of the letters of Paul, and that's fine. Judaizing, the idea that you have to become a Jew to become a Christian, that's condemned, but Jewishness is not condemned. We know that in the New Testament, the vast majority of the early people who became Christians came from a Jewish background. They were Jews, and they did not give up all of their traditions at that time, and nor were they called to do so. The only issue was the idea that one had to become a Jew to become a Christian. That was the point. Let's finish off by reading something Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 31. So, whether you eat or drink, or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. Do not cause anyone to stumble, whether Jews, Greeks, or the church of God, even as I try to please everyone in every way, for I am not seeking my own good, but the good of many, so that they may be saved. Our greatest hero, Jesus, was Jewish. The great preacher to the Gentiles, Paul, was Jewish. And he did not wish to cause offense to Jew or Gentile, And so he was careful about what he said, and so must we be. So what are your thoughts about this? How do we avoid being politically correct and yet also sensitive? What's politically correct for the sake of not trying to offend anybody, in that sense I mean, but how do we remain sensitive? What do we do about that? What in your experience has been helpful in the way you moderate your language? And what kind of feedback have you had from people from a Jewish background if they've been to our churches and heard you speak or become members of our congregations and become Christians? I'd like to know your thoughts. You can email me, mccx@mac.com, or you can leave a message anywhere you hear or see this recording. Until the next time, I hope you have a wonderful day and a terrific Tuesday. God bless.